Most of us, when we hear the word parable, we immediately associate it with Jesus. Oh, parables? That's the thing that Jesus did. Parables? That's that like Jesus thing, right? But in the ancient world, that wasn't the case. I mean, people, just normal people, told parables and knew about parables and enjoyed parables. It was just a regular form of communication. The ancient form of the parable is related in some ways to the ancient form of the riddle. If you know like this much about Greco-Roman or Egyptian mythology and storytelling, you know that riddles were kind of a thing. You know, the hero on his quest would have to answer a riddle to get on to the next level of the quest. Or when going before the Sphinx, you'd have to answer the riddle in order to get to the next place. Riddles have this thing about them that when you figure the riddle out, or if you don't figure the riddle out and someone tells you the answer, when we're confronted with the answer to the riddle, we all go, oh. There's that shock of realization when we realize that, oh, yes, now we've got it. There's an ancient riddle that goes like this. What creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs at night? You might know this, you might not. If you don't, it's us. We crawl on all 4s in the early part of our life. We walk on 2 legs in the middle part of our life. And many of us then end up getting a cane, which becomes the 3rd leg towards the sunset of our life. So if you didn't know that, you might go, oh, of course, that makes sense now. This parable for this Sunday has that shock of awareness in it. If you just turn the parable over enough, you eventually come, you're like, oh, that's something. So very briefly, this parable Jesus told, Luke tells us, to some. Sometimes he tells parables to his disciples. Sometimes he tells parables to the multitudes. This is to a kind of specific some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Ooh, I mean, not exactly the most fun people to be around, the people who are always treating other people with contempt. So he tells this parable to the some. And in this parable, there are 2 figures. And so obviously we're set up, these figures are set up to sort of diametrically opposed to one another, and we're going to want to choose one over the other. The first character in the parable is a Pharisee. A Pharisee was an ancient Jewish teacher. Pharisees focused intently on the scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, and specifically the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Many Pharisees would memorize those entire books. And if you've ever read Numbers and Deuteronomy, you know that, like, wow, that takes some serious religious devotion. So they aren't bad people at all. Now, Jesus has a problem with some of them, not all of them, but some of them, because of their hypocrisy. I would say it's not just because they're Pharisees, but because they're religious leaders. I mean, we all know, just turn on the news, that are some religious leaders like upstanding men and women? I hope so. But are some of us like total hypocrites? Yeah. The same today as it was back then. And what really fired Jesus up wasn't the fact that they were Pharisees. What fired him up was that some of them were hypocrites. This Pharisee in this parable does not appear to be a hypocrite. He goes into the temple and he starts praying. Not so bad. The first words out of his mouth are, God, I thank you. This is a prayer of gratitude. It's a prayer of thanksgiving. And it doesn't seem to be a hypocritical prayer. It seems to be a very honest prayer. He's honestly grateful for something. It's just that what he's thankful for is kind of terrible. He says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, We're even like this tax collector over here. Now, we compare people all the time, and we sometimes compare our situation with other people's situation, right? Like, you have a kid, sits down at dinner, parents serve the kid green beans. The kid can't stand green beans, and one of the parents would say to the kid, hey, you should be grateful you have green beans. There are kids in some other country you've never heard of, and they would love to have those green beans, so you eat all these green beans. And then if the kid has his wits about him, the kid says, fine, we'll box these green beans up and send them on. But we realize our fortune, and we realize that others sometimes don't have the same fortune that we do, and so we are glad for what we have. And that might be in the early part of this prayer, oh God, I thank you that I'm not like others, thieves, rogues, adulterers. I mean, that's not so bad. But then he gets really personal with like this tax collector over here. Like he's glad that he's not like this guy. And it's just kind of terrible, right? And then he puffs himself up and he says, he brings out his resume to God as if God doesn't already know it. He's like, God, I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. So, kind of bravado and puffing himself up and look how much better I am than everybody else. And then Jesus goes on to the tax collector. Tax collectors in ancient Judea were despised, not just because they were collecting taxes and no one likes taxes. They worked for the empire, the Roman Empire. Jerusalem and Judea was held by an occupying force. They weren't able to govern themselves. They were governed by Rome. And the tax collectors, they weren't collecting taxes for like Jerusalem public works projects. They were collecting taxes to send back to the occupying force. They were collaborators with the occupiers. So people just couldn't stand tax collectors, and they were sort of seen as scoundrels. But this tax collector in this parable, Jesus says that he comes into the temple, but he doesn't go all the way to the front. He sort of stays in the back. He doesn't lift up his head. He keeps his head bowed, like in some form of humility. And his prayer is, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. So both men go to the temple. Both men go to pray. They both pray genuine prayers. This is pretty good. It's just that one guy's prayer reveals kind of a terrible heart, and the other guy's prayer doesn't seem to do that. The tax collector's prayer is about how he's a sinner, and the Pharisee's prayer is about how the tax collector's a sinner, instead of realizing his own faults and issues and sins. So we have these two figures. Which one does this parable want us to be? It's really not a hard question, right? Like there's no trick question here. Obviously, we want to be like the tax collector, right? We want to be humble. We don't want to be judging other people. We do not want to be like this Pharisee who thinks terrible things, who prays for terrible things. We should be grateful that we are not like this Pharisee. In fact, if we just stop right now, we could pray a prayer, oh God, I thank you that I am not like this Wait a minute. Do you see what happened there? The minute we start judging the Pharisee for being kind of terrible, we become the Pharisee. And that is what this parable is about. And that's that little shock of realization that's sort of built into this parable. If we go back to the beginning, when Luke sets this parable up, he says Jesus tells this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. And this parable is about that. It's about not trusting in ourselves that we're great and perfect. It's about being fully honest and realizing that, hey, we got good stuff, but we got some stuff we need to work on too. And chiefly, it's about not regarding others with contempt. It's about not judging other people. This past week, I was involved in a town forum town hall put on by a Coalition for a Drug-Free New Jersey and our local community in crisis. And on the town hall, there was the local prosecutor, there was a medical doctor, there was one of the founders of Community in Crisis, and then there was a young woman who is a recovering addict herself. And there was another woman that sat right next to me who just lost her sister to an overdose. And we had an interesting discussion, and all of us sort of talked about the issue of addictions from our own specific perspectives. But then one of the questions that it's kind of obvious that came around was, okay, so what do we do about it? What do we do about it? And the discussion took an interesting turn, and I want to share that discussion with you right now.
Bouncing through my head ever since Jody said it was, this is not a casserole disease, and it's so true. I mean, I feel like at least our clergy group and the churches and synagogues and other houses of worship that are involved in that are doing a good job of saying, hey, there's a problem, and we're talking about the problem, but we're still not able to wrap our arms around people in the way that we would with someone that is having open heart surgery or going through chemotherapy, or had a baby where there's meal trains and there's calls and there's flowers. And I don't have an answer to your question other than we need a sea change to be able to make that happen.
And I would add to that, not only for those who are in the addiction, but their family members, and especially for their children. And from, my sister's children that are, her son is, he's 11. Was he 11 or 12, Mom? My mom came, she's 12. My mom's back there. And 9 is her daughter. And it breaks our heart. Like recently, he's not invited to certain things, to birthday parties. There was a time, he had a friend that was down the street who's actually 2, and maybe even 3 now, I'm discovering. Their parents do not allow them to hang out with him anymore. They stop them from hanging out. And he's little, and he makes up these stories in his head of why, but we know why. And it's heartbreaking. And in the house that me and my sister grew up in, my uncle, my mom's brother, died of a heroin overdose. And so we saw that. And of course we were we got treated weird. People thought we were, we always felt like we were the other side of the tracks, like we were unworthy. I don't think we understood it. And I also understand being on the side, because Manny will come home and be like, I heard that this kid does that smoking thing, whatever you're talking about. And I'm like, stay away from that kid. Like, because I get it a little bit. I'm not a parent, I'm an aunt, but I also understand the fear of trying to protect your children. But there's got to be something where we're human to each other. And I think the thing that stood out to me, Amanda, of course, you being here alone stands out the most to me. Like, but what you were saying about the sense of community and belonging, that is, I don't know what the studies are. I was asking my husband on my way here, I'm like, can you share with me, what does the data show of how to prevent this? And I don't know what the data is, but something tells me if we loved each other, if we cared for each other, if we weren't afraid of each other because you make different, you have a different amount of money, or you vote a different way, or you smell, or whatever it is, like, I don't like your lawn ornament. Like, if we took care of each other, and we see examples of that, in our community, we have Heartworks doing that, but it shouldn't need to be an organization that's doing that. It should be us doing it for each other, and I think that ultimately would be massive. But I think obviously I'm not saying we can't, we also intentionally need to address it. And since I'm here and I have the mic, please, if you have kids at Bernardsville schools, like, talk to them and know that my niece and nephew are there, and love on them specifically. They need extra love from this community now that their mother is no longer here.
Thank you. Why can't we just love one another? Why can't we just be good to one another? Why can't we just look at each other and not see their problems, their mistakes, their conditions, their diseases? This parable was directed to the sum. And I think the strength of this parable is in realizing that sometimes we're a part of that sum. There are times that we judge other people for who they are and what they look like. And this parable is about leaving the sum. It's about praying the prayer of the tax collector, God, be merciful to me, a sinner who blows it and isn't perfect. And it's about loving our neighbor as ourself.